All right, tonight we're diving into the hot, dusty, olive oil scented world of ancient Greece, a place we often link to big ideas like democracy, philosophy, and all those statues that refuse to wear pants. But behind the stories of Plato, epic warriors, and golden temples, life was a whole lot rougher than the myths suggest. Sure, ancient Greece helped lay the groundwork for Western civilization, but for the average person, just getting through a day was no small feat. Before we go further, if you enjoy this kind of deep dive, hit the like button and subscribe, only if you're actually into this stuff. Drop a comment with your location and what time you're watching. It's always cool to see how far this little community reaches. Now, settle in. Maybe lower the lights or let a fan hum in the background, and let's take a quiet trip back to the streets of ancient Greece. Your morning starts not with a snooze button, but with the sun heating your house like a slow cooker. You live in a basic home made of sun-dried mud bricks, or maybe rough stone, with small windows that have no glass, just wooden shutters to keep the goats out, and, if you're lucky, let in a breeze. There's no insulation, no fans spinning overhead, and if you think you've got your own space, think again, unless you're counting the goat-free corner of the room. You don't wake up early because you're disciplined. You do it because staying in bed becomes unbearable once the stone walls start radiating yesterday's heat back at you. In the winter, same walls, but now they turn your house into an icebox. You probably sleep on a thin mat or a mattress stuffed with straw. Pillows? Try a rolled-up cloak or your arm. And if you're wondering about lice, yeah, they were probably with you too. There's no running water, so your morning bathroom routine means walking to a public fountain or, if you live in the countryside, dragging heavy clay jars from a nearby well. You hoist the water onto your shoulder and hope not to trip and waste hours of effort and a few vertebrae. You're not bathing first thing in the morning either. That's an evening thing, if it happens at all. Maybe you splash your face, rub some olive oil on your skin, and scrape it off with a metal tool called a strigil. Think ancient exfoliation without the luxury or the results. Forget privacy. Your whole family lives in one room. You all sleep there, eat there, argue there. The street outside, that's your hallway, your source of gossip, and also your garbage bin. You haven't had a single bite yet, and you're already sweaty, your back aches, and your tunic is sticking to all the wrong places. And here's the thing. This is actually the easiest part of your day. So, breakfast time. You'd think you'd get something hearty, right? Not even close. This meal makes modern-day fasting look like a buffet. You start your day with maza, which is basically barley bread, stale, heavy, and only slightly more flavorful than the dirt it was baked on. It's made from ground barley mixed with water, then baked on hot stones or in leftover ashes. Think of it as an ancient granola bar that forgot how to be tasty. Sometimes you dunk it in watered-down wine. Not to get tipsy, but because the water isn't safe to drink. No filters, no boiling, no fancy clay pitcher with clean water. Everyone, kids, adults, old folks, drinks diluted wine just to stay alive. And unless you've got money, and let's be real, you don't. That's about it. If you're lucky or well off, maybe you get a fig, a few olives, or a bit of goat cheese. But chances are you're not that lucky. And that's just your morning. Welcome to the real ancient Greece. If your morning bread isn't crawling with yesterday's flies or hard enough to chip a tooth, count yourself lucky. There's no coffee to perk you up, no eggs sizzling in a pan, and definitely no fruit salad drizzled in honey, unless you live near a beekeeper and know how to grease the right palms. Breakfast isn't a relaxed, sit-down moment either. There are no chairs, no forks, and no one pondering their food mindfully. You eat standing or squatting, chew quickly, maybe nod to someone nearby, and get back to whatever labor is waiting for you. Now, if you're a woman, you probably don't even eat with the men. In a lot of households, women and kids eat separately, often after the men are done. So not only is the food bland and basic, you also have to wait for your share of disappointment. That's the irony. This is the same culture that gave us grand feasts, long dinners filled with music and wine, and entire poems about grapes. But breakfast? That barely earns a sentence. It's dry, usually burned, and utterly joyless. Still, you eat. You push through that rock-hard barley cake and watered-down wine, because that's the only thing fueling you through a day filled with heat, chores, and possibly a philosopher loudly questioning your life choices. Bon appetit, just don't break a tooth. After your crunchy excuse for a meal, it's time to freshen up, though that phrase is generous. Hygiene in ancient Greece isn't about smelling good or feeling clean. It's more of a daily ritual that's less about results and more about habit. Soap doesn't exist yet. That's a luxury for future civilizations. If you're lucky, you live near a public fountain or communal basin. If not, it's a bucket of cold water, maybe poured over your head if you've got a spare jug. There's no shampoo, no foamy body wash, and no sponge, unless you've stolen one from a diver in the Aegean. Instead, you reach for olive oil, not for cooking, but for cleaning. You rub it on your skin, which helps loosen dirt and sweat, then scrape it off with a striggle, a curved bronze blade. It's not exactly refreshing, more like wiping off your own human marinade. And if you're wondering whether this feels awkward, just remember, it's done in public, often naked, and almost always loudly. Privacy? Not part of the deal. Dental care? That's a gamble. No brushes or paste. Maybe you rub your gums with charcoal or rinse with vinegar if you're really trying. But most folks just chew on twigs and cross their fingers. Fresh breath isn't a thing. Neither is deodorant. Body odor is everywhere. If you have money, you might dab a bit of perfume. Myrrh, rose oil, something fancy, on your neck before heading out. But give it an hour in the Athenian sun and you're back to smelling like dust, sweat, and survival. As for your clothes, think simple. You've got two main options, a chiton or a himation. They're both big pieces of fabric, usually linen, that you wrap around yourself and hold together with pins or a belt. That's it. No buttons, no zippers, nothing fitted. It's all flowing robes and crossed fingers that the wind doesn't give the town a surprise show. Underwear? Not a thing. Bras? Definitely not. Unless you're a Spartan woman trained in sports, you're mostly just hoping everything stays where it should. So yeah, ancient Greece gave us democracy, philosophy, and beautiful temples. But when it comes to staying clean, dressed, and fed, it was more about just getting by than living large. Your clothes shift around you like a curtain that won't stay closed. Footwear? If you're fortunate, you've got leather sandals. Otherwise, it's bare feet all day on sun-scorched stones, dirt worn by goats, and the squishy leftovers of the marketplace ground into the roads. Picture walking across a frying pan in July while dodging donkey droppings. That's your commute. Protection from the sun? Forget it. No hats unless you're farming or sailing, and sunscreen hasn't even been dreamed up yet. The ancient Aegean sun doesn't care how wise or philosophical you are. It's still going to roast you by midday. By noon, your shoulders are already cooked, your robe is stuck to you in impossible ways, and your feet look like they've been through battle. And don't be shocked if you see someone fully naked in public. Nudity isn't taboo. Men train naked at the gymnasium, and some public figures barely keep their togas pinned together during speeches. If you're rich, maybe your tunics dyed a gentle saffron or a faded purple. But most folks wear dull whites and browns. Dyes are expensive, and no one's wasting them on a fisherman or a net mender. So you're out there, baked by the sun, sweating through your toga wrap, silently praying your brooch doesn't give out while passing a temple priestess. And keep in mind, this is still just partway through your day. Military service? That's not a career, it's your obligation. In cities like Athens or Sparta, if you're a free man, you're automatically a soldier. There's no maybe about it. By your early teens, you're already swinging wooden swords and drilling in phalanx formations. Those tight battle lines where survival depends on your neighbor not tripping over his own sandals. In Sparta, it's even harsher. Boys are thrown into the agoge system at age 7, where they're trained through hunger, beatings, and forced isolation until only the strongest endure. Athens is a little softer, but military training is still mandatory. 2 years in your late teens, then you're basically on call for the rest of your life. Even if you're a deep thinker or a lover of poetry, tough luck. Socrates himself marched into battle, not armed with ideas, but with weapons. There's always some war going on. Sparta against Athens, Athens against Persia, Sparta against everyone, or a neighboring polis getting mouthy about who controls a trade port. Peace is just the pause before the next fight. And here's a brutal twist. You bring your own gear. Helmet, breastplate, greaves, round shield, spear, if you can afford it. If not, leather and cloth it is, which means good luck surviving the front line. Poorer citizens often fight light and die fast. There's no government-issued armor, no pay, and no help when you're injured. You train, march, row in warships, argue about tactics in the assembly, and if you survive, maybe someone carves your name on a cheap gravestone with a generic line about courage. And if that sounds tough, just wait until we talk about what life was like for women. In most Greek city-states, Athens especially, being a woman meant having fewer rights than a piece of pottery. You couldn't vote, couldn't own land in your own name, and couldn't hold office. Most of your existence was spent indoors, in the shadow of rules written by and for men. Stepping outside without a male relative? That was risky. If people saw you out too often, they might assume you were a courtesan, or, worse in their eyes, a Spartan. Let's look at your daily life. You're up before the sun, already tackling chores before most people are even awake. Your list: spin wool, weave fabric, grind grain, fetch water, bake the bread, manage any household slaves if you're wealthy enough, and raise the kids. You're basically running the entire household, but there's no paycheck, no status, and absolutely no time off. Your world is small. Social life? Minimal. You're not going to the theater, you're not joining philosophical talks, and you're definitely not down at the gymnasium. Those are for men, usually naked ones. You spend most of your life inside the gynaikon, the women's quarters, tucked away from the world. A glance through a latticed window is often your only view of the outside. Education? Maybe a little if your family is generous. You might learn to read, but mostly you're taught how to run a home. Geometry, philosophy, public speaking, that's for boys. Your future? Marry well, produce sons, and stay invisible while doing it. And you marry young, early teens most likely. The groom, often twice your age. It's not about love. It's an arrangement between your father and another man sealed with a dowry. Your worth, tied closely to your ability to bear children. Your womb becomes your resume. Now Spartan women, they had more freedom. They could exercise in public, get an education, even own land. Sounds great, right? But that freedom came with a catch. The state valued them mainly for one thing: producing strong babies to fill Spartan military ranks. If you couldn't, you were disgraced. And if your husband died, your rights didn't expand. You needed permission to remarry, and your options shrank fast. So while Spartan women had more power on paper, that power was tightly bound to a militaristic and ruthless system. Meanwhile, goddesses like Athena and Artemis were worshipped, celebrated in myth and marble. But actual women? They were expected to stay quiet, stay inside, and stay forgotten. And while we're on the topic of inclusion, let's talk about democracy. Yes, Athens is often called the birthplace of democracy, but don't picture anything too inclusive. Odds are you wouldn't be allowed to vote. Most people weren't. To take part in the Athenian assembly, the ecclesia, you had to be male, born to Athenian parents, and over 18. That left out women, children, slaves, and foreigners, called metics, which means nearly 90% of Athens' population had zero political rights. So democracy? More like a private club for sunburned sandal-wearing citizens. If you did make the cut, you weren't just casting a ballot. You were expected to show up, propose laws, debate them, and vote, often in huge gatherings of thousands. There were no professional politicians. Every eligible man was part lawmaker, part judge, and part guy just winging it. You could even be selected by lottery to manage the city treasury or sit on a jury, no experience needed. One day your cousin who can't count could be running Athens' finances. The next, your fishmonger might be deciding a murder case. And if someone rose too high or got a little too admired, the people had a solution: ostracism. Once a year, citizens could write down a name on a broken pottery shard, an ostracon, and vote to banish that person for 10 years. No trial, no explanation, just goodbye. Too popular, too loud, too powerful, out you go. Even with all its problems, Athenian democracy was a game changer. It gave ordinary citizens, well, some of them, a say in how things were run. And though it was far from fair by modern standards, it set the stage for the political systems that came later. But don't get it twisted. This wasn't some fair, open, or welcoming system. If you were a woman, your voice didn't count. If you were a foreign-born resident paying taxes like everyone else, still silenced. If you were a slave, even one building the Parthenon, you had no say. Ask too many questions as a philosopher, and you might end up executed. Democracy may have been born in ancient Greece, but if you showed up expecting equal rights, you'd be kicked out of the assembly and handed a pottery shard to vote yourself into exile. Slavery wasn't just accepted, it was part of the fabric of daily life. Even families with modest means usually had at least one slave. Not because they were rich, but because slavery was so deeply embedded in Greek society that not owning another human being was practically unheard of. It was as normal as wearing sandals or getting sunburned. Slaves didn't come from one place or race. They were captured from all over: Thracians, Scythians, Syrians, and even other Greeks from the wrong polis at the wrong time. Some were prisoners of war, others were kidnapped, and many were born into slavery. It was a huge market, and there was always demand. In Athens, your household slave did everything: cooking, cleaning, fetching water, carrying groceries, even raising your kids. Some managed your business or household while you reclined at a symposium, sipping watered-down wine and arguing about the nature of justice. Peak irony. In the Laurian silver mines, the picture was even darker. Slaves, including children, worked in terrifying conditions, crawling through pitch-black tunnels, breathing toxic dust, dying slow deaths just to fill city coffers and fund festivals. Yes, some slaves were educated. They taught grammar, kept books, managed bank accounts. But none of that changed their reality. They were still property, no rights. They could be sold, beaten, branded, or killed at any time. If a slave somehow earned their freedom, and a few did, they were never truly free. They owed loyalty to their former masters and were barred from becoming citizens. That meant no voting, no owning land, no holding office, just a slightly less awful version of the life they'd already endured. And there was no movement to end it, no moral uprising. Philosophers like Aristotle, the same Aristotle who shaped Western thought, argued that slavery was natural. He believed some people were born to be slaves. Let that sink in. So yes, ancient Greece gave us powerful ideas like democracy, ethics, and logic. But those ideas were built on the backs of people who were never allowed to participate, never allowed to speak, and never allowed to matter. That's not just an unfortunate side note, it's the very foundation. And if you got sick in ancient Greece, you were in trouble. Unless you happened to live next to Hippocrates himself, your healthcare options were little more than folk remedies and desperate prayers. There were no hospitals. If you were injured or ill, you stayed home. Maybe a neighbor knew a few herbal recipes. Maybe someone in your family could recite a healing prayer to Asclepius, the god of medicine. Maybe your local temple had a sacred snake you could pet for good luck. That was the extent of your medical support. The best-known Greek doctors were part herbalist, part philosopher, and part guesswork. Their entire system was based on the four humors: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. Get sick and they'd blame it on one of those being out of balance. Fever, too much blood, time to drain some. Coughing, must be excess phlegm, better stop eating for a while. Feeling depressed, that's black bile. Maybe take a long walk and stare off into the distance dramatically. Treatments were inconsistent, mostly untested, and often involved garlic, leeches, fasting, or crushed poppy seeds. It was more trial and error than medicine, and hope was often the main ingredient. Boiled figs, a vinegar compress mixed with whatever someone scraped off a goat. That was medicine. Did it work? Occasionally. Did it hurt? Almost always. Surgery was rare and absolutely terrifying, something you only did when there were no other options left. There was no anesthesia, no antiseptics, and no concept of sterilization. A small wound could easily become infected and end your life. The tools? Iron knives, bone saws, and whatever prayers you could muster. If you needed a limb removed, you'd better have a leather strap to bite down on, because that was your only pain relief. Childbirth? It was brutal even on a good day. Midwives did what they could, but maternal and infant mortality rates were high. One bad angle, one twisted shoulder, one breech baby, and that was it. If you were rich, maybe you could call in a traveling physician with a scroll full of wisdom and a pouch of fancy oils. If not, you relied on old remedies, home knowledge, and sheer luck. Sometimes you got better, sometimes you didn't. There were a few upsides. They believed in rest, clean air, and a balanced diet, which isn't nothing. Ancient Greek medicine gave the world the Hippocratic Oath, but it also gave us prescriptions like drink cabbage water and sleep facing the sea. Healthcare in ancient Greece was mostly herbs, hope, and hanging in there. Now, theater in ancient Greece? That was a whole different experience. Part religion, part civic duty, and part emotional endurance challenge. Let's start with what worked. For male citizens, theater was free. If you were a woman, a slave, or a foreigner, don't expect a seat. Huge open-air theaters carved into hillsides, like the massive theater of Dionysus in Athens, held thousands. People packed in shoulder to shoulder under the open sky and stayed there all day. Literally all day. The Dionysia Festival ran from sunrise to sunset, with tragedy, comedy, and satyr plays back to back. There were no breaks, no snacks, no bathrooms, unless you considered a bush halfway up the hill. And don't even think about showing up late or acting out. You could be fined for disrupting the performance. Theater was serious business. The tragedies were raw, stories of war, madness, curses, and gods tearing families apart over decisions made generations earlier. These weren't feel-good tales. You came to cry alongside strangers. Then came the comedies, loud, wild, and biting. They didn't pull punches. Politicians, philosophers, even whole cities were mocked. Picture a mashup of Saturday Night Live and a town hall roast. Then add giant fake body parts and platform sandals. All actors were men, even for the female roles. They wore huge masks, padded costumes, and sometimes looked like walking political cartoons. The chorus? They were the voice of the crowd, singing, dancing, reacting, like a live, opinionated Greek Twitter feed in tunics. And the audience didn't sit quietly either. They shouted, argued, laughed, booed, and even threw things if the play didn't land. At the end of the festival, a jury would decide which playwright won the honor. So you might sit through 3 days of sobbing over Orestes, only to watch a vulgar comedy featuring a talking pig god take the top prize. That was theater in Greece, intense, participatory, and always unpredictable. Once the final chorus faded and the crowd dispersed, you'd head into the agora, the buzzing public square. And just like that, you'd run into a barefoot man in a threadbare cloak, staring into the distance and asking strangers, "What is justice?" Welcome to philosophy. In Athens, it wasn't just a school subject, it was the local sport. And the thinkers? They were celebrities. Socrates, Plato, Aristotle. Today, they're giants of philosophy. Back then, just 3 odd guys who made a habit of turning conversations into chaos. Take Socrates, for example. His whole life was basically a one-man mission to confuse people. He'd wander up to you while you were just trying to buy olives or mind your business near a goat and hit you with, "Do you believe in truth?" You'd answer, unsure, and before you knew it, you were 3 hours deep in self-doubt, questioning your entire worldview and strongly considering a quiet life in Sparta. Socrates never wrote anything down. Plato did that for him. But his impact was massive. Part of that legacy came from the fact that Athens eventually got fed up and executed him. The official charges were corrupting the youth and not believing in the gods. But let's be honest, it was probably because he wouldn't stop turning dinner parties into debate club. Philosophy in ancient Greece wasn't a quiet library activity. It was loud, intense, and a bit like verbal wrestling. Arguments broke out in public squares, on the steps of temples, or mid-walk through the agora. No microphones, no moderation, just voices, dramatic hand gestures, and enough ego to fill the Parthenon. And if you thought you could just pass by without getting pulled in, think again. Philosophers loved catching random people in their logic traps. You'd mutter one thing about virtue and end up being the day's live demo on flawed thinking. Even kids weren't safe. Aristotle, for instance, was the tutor of young Alexander. Yes, that Alexander, the one who later marched across continents and conquered half the known world. Imagine your teenage civics teacher handing you a sword and saying, "Go fix civilization." So yes, Greek philosophy gave us logic, ethics, science, and government theory. But it also gave everyday Athenians a solid chance of being humiliated in public by a man in sandals and a toga asking too many questions. Now say you actually managed to thrive in Athens. You're articulate, smart, maybe even a bit charismatic. People like you. They listen when you speak. Congratulations, you're in danger. In Athens, popularity could be a liability. Get too influential, and the very democracy you believe in might kick you out of the city for a decade. Not jail, not a fine, just gone. This wasn't some shadowy plot. It was a built-in system called ostracism, and it was very real. Once a year, Athenians would vote on whether to hold an ostracism. If the vote passed, every eligible citizen wrote down the name of someone they thought should be exiled on a broken piece of pottery called an ostracon. If someone's name showed up 6,000 times or more, they were told to leave. No trial, no reason needed. Just pack up and disappear for 10 years. You didn't need to commit a crime. In fact, most ostracized people hadn't done anything wrong, other than be a little too effective, too admired, or too noticeable. You might be a war hero, a smooth talker, or just really annoyingly noble. Whatever it was, your neighbors decided you were a threat to democracy, and democracy voted to yeet you into the countryside. But here's the kicker. It wasn't forever. After 10 years, you could return. Your property would still be there. Your status, intact. No hard feelings, at least officially. It was like an extended involuntary sabbatical you never signed up for. Some big names got ostracized. Aristides the Just, so well loved that someone reportedly voted against him just because they were tired of hearing how perfect he was. Or Themistocles, the military hero who helped defeat the Persians at Salamis, banished after getting a little too full of himself. In Athens, even saving the city came with a shelf life. Ostracism was meant to prevent tyrants from rising, but more often it punished success. So if you were smart, you kept your speeches short, your victories modest, and your hair just slightly less perfect than necessary, just in case. If you were a little too charismatic in ancient Athens, people noticed, and not in a good way. Think of it like an ancient reality show, but instead of winning money and fame, the prize for gaining too many fans was exile. Pack your dignity, your olive oil, and enjoy 10 years in the countryside. Athens may have invented democracy, but it also invented cancel culture, 2,500 years early. And life, it wasn't long. Nobody asked if they'd die young. The only questions were how soon and how badly. Life expectancy floated around 30 to 35 years, but that was only if you survived childhood, which a third of kids didn't. Disease, bad food, non-existent hygiene, and risky childbirth took care of the rest. You could die from almost anything. A small cut could turn septic. A mystery fever might burn through your whole household. Drinking water from the wrong fountain could knock you out before dinner. Medicine was limited, and divine help, spotty at best. In cities, disease spread like wildfire thanks to cramped homes, shared fountains, and open sewage. During the Peloponnesian War, the plague of Athens took out nearly a third of the population. Historian Thucydides wrote about it, then caught it, then somehow lived. Most weren't that lucky. And war, it was always happening. If you were a man, chances were you'd die in armor or at the oar of a warship. Even if the enemy didn't get you, a battle wound could turn fatal days later without antibiotics or stitches, just olive oil, hope, and maybe a garlic poultice. Then there were the gods. Displease one, even accidentally, and you might meet your end by plague, lightning, or a surprise goat stampede. Forget a ritual, mock a statue, offend Zeus after a little too much wine, the consequences could be immediate. Proper funerals mattered a lot. You needed coins for Charon the ferryman, rituals to get to the afterlife, and a grave your family could tend. If your family couldn't afford all that, your body might be dumped outside the city walls, unmarked. And to the Greeks, that wasn't just sad, it was a spiritual crisis. They believed unburied souls wandered forever, stuck between life and death, forgotten and lost. Death wasn't beautiful, it was daily, and it didn't care how clever, noble, or famous you were. A mosquito, a moldy fig, or an offended god could end you, no matter who you were, slave or statesman. The gods, they weren't exactly chill. In theory, Greek religion was about living in harmony with the divine. You honored Zeus, Hera, Athena, Apollo, Artemis, Poseidon, and the rest of the Mount Olympus gang. But in practice, it was non-stop spiritual damage control. These weren't calm, benevolent deities. They were powerful, dramatic, and constantly in a bad mood. Forget a sacrifice? Your crops withered. Mumble a prayer? Your ship sank. Step into the wrong grove? Snakebite, plague, drought. Choose your punishment. They didn't just want loyalty, they wanted perfect timing, spotless rituals, and unwavering devotion. Religion wasn't a once-a-week temple visit. It was daily life. You kept altars at home. You performed seasonal rites. Whole cities paused for festivals. Planting crops, pray to Demeter. Going to battle, make an offering to Ares. Sailing, pour wine for Poseidon. and maybe toss in a goat for good measure. Each god had moods, favorites, grudges. Apollo might bless your city, unless your great-grandfather said something rude, in which case, enjoy being cursed for generations. Hera, goddess of marriage, often spent her time punishing mortal women Zeus had flirted with. Athena gave wisdom, but also turned a woman into a spider for bragging about her weaving. No warnings, just divine chaos. And it didn't stop with the big names. You also had to watch out for nymphs, satyrs, spirits, and river gods, any of whom might hex you for stepping on the wrong flower. Living in ancient Greece meant constantly trying to survive both nature and the supernatural, usually while barefoot. And as if angry gods weren't enough, monsters were always a possibility too. Take a wrong step on some sacred patch of forest, and suddenly your leg belongs to a vengeful woodland spirit. The worst part? You never really knew what you did wrong. Was it a missed sacrifice? Bad timing? A dream where you offended a god? Maybe it was your cousin, or something your great-grandfather said once. Didn't matter. The gods didn't just hold grudges, they personalized them. Still, for all the chaos and fear, Greek religion was everywhere. It wasn't just about worship. It shaped politics, weddings, farming, even the Olympic Games. You feared the gods, yes, but you also needed them. Their temples marked your cities. Their festivals filled your calendar. Their stories explained everything from thunderstorms to falling in love. You didn't believe because you had faith. You believed because not believing felt like asking for trouble. So after the boiling houses, the stale barley breakfasts, the endless blisters from your sandals, the wars, the plagues, the angry gods, and the goat-related injuries, here's the big question. Could you survive a single day in ancient Greece? Let's be honest. No. You'd be done before lunchtime. The heat would break you. The diet would leave you cranky. The constant fear of being killed by either a spear or a thunderbolt would erase any romantic toga fantasy you had. You're probably not ready to haul water before the sun's up or squat over a dirt hole next to a temple goat. You'd miss your painkillers, your plumbing. Your right to complain without being banished for it via pottery shard. You might dream of ancient Greece as marble statues, wise philosophers, and thrilling poetry. But that was the 1%. For most people, it was hard labor, no rights, and a whole lot of funerals. Democracy? Only if you were male, free, and full-blooded Athenian. Medicine, garlic and crossed fingers. Religion, a full-time job keeping gods from ruining your crops. Social media, a guy shouting about justice in the agora while holding a dead fish. And yet, they endured. They built temples that still defy time. They wrote plays that still make us feel. They asked questions we're still trying to answer. They mapped stars, defined ethics, invented politics, and shaped what we now call civilization. They didn't get through it because life was kind. They got through it because they found meaning inside the madness. They challenged, fought, sang, died, and left behind something lasting. So no, you probably wouldn't survive your first sunstroke, goat bite, or surprise philosophy ambush from a guy in sandals. But if you did, if you adjusted, hung in there, and really listened, you might find yourself among some of the fiercest, most complex, most brilliantly flawed people history has ever seen. And they wouldn't mock you for struggling. They'd toss you a tunic, point to a heavy amphora, and say, "Good, now carry that up a hill." It all started with a death and a betrayal. Prasutagus, king of the Iceni tribe in what's now eastern England, had played his cards well. He ruled under Roman control as a client king, walking the fine line between independence and submission. For years, he kept peace and power by staying useful to the empire. But when he died around 60 AD, he left behind a will meant to protect his people. He named the Roman emperor as co-heir alongside his 2 young daughters. It was a diplomatic gesture, one final bid to keep the peace. Rome ignored it completely. There were no negotiations, no compromises. Rome didn't recognize the will. It annexed the Iceni lands outright. Soldiers poured in, seizing homes, livestock, territory, everything. Rome thought it could stamp out resistance by punishing a queen, but it made a far greater mistake. After taking her family's wealth, they did something crueler, something meant to shatter her completely. They flogged Queen Boudica in public. Not just to hurt her, but to humiliate her, to declare, "You are nothing." And then, in front of her eyes, they assaulted her daughters. This wasn't law enforcement. It was a brutal message wrapped in violence. the kind designed to crush a people's will. But Boudica didn't break. She turned her pain into power. Rome had expected submission. They thought they were trampling a minor tribal figure. What they had actually done was awaken a force they couldn't control, a mother, a queen, a leader whose rage would echo across the land. Her fury would not just burn in her heart, it would set entire cities on fire. She would show Rome that even mighty empires can bleed. News of what happened to Boudica didn't stay quiet. It traveled fast, carried on whispers and shouts across Britannia. Other tribes heard, and in that story, they saw themselves. They remembered the taxes, the stolen land, the sons who never came home. Rome had ruled by keeping the tribes scattered, disconnected. But now there was one thing uniting them all: Boudica's fury. Rome had broken their word, shattered a royal family, and with it, cracked the illusion of their invincibility. This wasn't just a misstep. It was the match that lit one of the fiercest uprisings Rome would ever know. They'd hoped Boudica would disappear, lost in grief. They didn't understand her at all. She wasn't made to submit. She was born to lead. Even Roman historians, who rarely had kind words for their enemies, couldn't ignore her presence. They wrote of a tall woman with blazing red hair flowing to her waist, a voice like thunder rolling through battle. She didn't just wear a crown, she embodied defiance. And in the face of horror, she became something more powerful than a queen, a mother with nothing left to lose. Rome had tried to strip away everything: her dignity, her children's future, her people's pride. But she refused to be erased. She knew Rome's true fear wasn't rebellion, it was unity. So, she set out to build it. She started with the Trinovantes, once strong before Rome bled them dry with taxes, seized their land, and forced them into servitude. When Boudica spoke, it wasn't with polished words or rehearsed lines. She spoke like someone who had lived through the fire and walked out carrying its heat. She reminded them of their ancestors, of their gods, and of the soil they no longer called their own. And they listened. Soon, others joined: the Corieltavi, the Cornovi, even parts of the Brigantes. Her grief had become a cause, and that cause was sacred, to cleanse their homeland of Roman arrogance. She never promised safety. What she promised was honor, and, if necessary, death. And they followed her, not because she hid behind them, but because she rode beside them, hair wild in the wind, spear in hand, eyes locked forward. She didn't forget the names of the raped, the enslaved, the murdered. She shouted them into the wind as a call to arms. She invoked the war goddess Andraste, not as myth, but as an ally. Her warriors believed her when she said the gods were on their side. She had no maps, no formal strategies, no Roman schooling in warfare. What she had was sharper than any sword, righteous fury shaped by pain, focused like a blade. The ground itself seemed to stir beneath her charge. This wasn't just a rebellion, it was the rising of something long buried. Rome thought it had broken her. Instead, it had sparked a storm, and that storm was only beginning. The Roman eagle had long flown above Britannia, confident in its strength. But now, the skies were shifting. The winds that once lifted that eagle high were turning against it. Boudica's fury wasn't a fire burning out of control. It was a storm gathering strength, with every heartbeat, every step, every cry for justice. Every storm needs something to keep it going, and for Boudica, that fuel came from the thousands of Britons who had spent years, generations even, waiting for someone to finally rise against the empire. Not someone who spoke in Roman words, but someone who spoke with action, with blood, and with iron. She gave them that voice. Her rebellion didn't begin with battles, but with gatherings, councils held beneath sacred trees and on quiet hills under the moon. She didn't sit high on a throne. She stood in the dirt, shoulder to shoulder with her people. She heard the grief of mothers, the fury of elders, the chants of druids reading signs in the stars. And through all their voices came one message: Rome had gone too far. It was time to fight back. Tribes started arriving. The Trinovantes came first, bringing spears and slings, their warriors chanting ancient songs of battle. The Iceni added their swift cavalry, riders painted for war, hair flying wild in the wind. More tribes followed, armed with blades, axes, and fire. Even the women took up weapons, moved by the strength of their queen. This wasn't just the rise of an army, it was the return of a people who remembered who they were before Rome. Still, Boudica was up against the Roman legions, well-trained, heavily armored, and deadly. She had no formal army, but she had numbers, deep knowledge of the land, and something Rome couldn't forge in a camp: hatred born of humiliation. Soon her ranks grew into the tens of thousands. Farmers laid down tools and picked up swords. Hunters became assassins. Roman slaves and mistreated allies switched sides. They weren't there for money. They fought for the memories of what had been taken, for revenge, and for the hope that their children could grow up free. Boudica spoke to them, her first of many speeches. Roman writers would later record her words, often twisting them, but one truth remains clear: she promised victory or death. There would be no surrender, no going back. The first target was Camulodunum. Once a proud center of British power, it had become a Roman colony, filled with statues, villas, and temples built by the same people who had crushed their way of life. The Temple of Claudius towered above the city, a tribute to the very emperor who had conquered them. To Rome, it was sacred. To Boudica and her people, it was an insult, and it would be the first to burn. This was no longer talk of rebellion. This was it. Camulodunum didn't stand a chance. It had become everything her people hated. Latin filled the streets where their chants once echoed. Roman buildings stood tall over sacred land. The temple, built by forced labor, glorified their conqueror and mocked their suffering. To Boudica, it wasn't a place of worship, it was a challenge. She gave the order. Her army moved like a wave, crashing down on the city. Roman settlers, many of them veterans who had taxed and terrorized the local tribes, were caught by surprise. The city had no real defenses, no walls, barely any guards, and no idea that war was on their doorstep. Some of the Roman troops tried to defend the temple, barricading themselves inside, hoping it could hold. It didn't. In 2 days, her forces broke through. What happened next wasn't a battle, it was a reckoning. No one was spared. Men, women, and children, everyone tied to the empire fell. But this wasn't just about soldiers or strategy. This was personal. They burned the villas, tore down the statues, and brought fire to every Roman symbol they could find. The temple itself was turned into an inferno, its roof collapsing into a blaze seen for miles. Those few who managed to escape didn't just carry injuries. They carried horror stories that chilled every Roman who heard them. The destruction wasn't random, it was focused. These were people whose lives had been torn apart, whose gods had been insulted, whose families had been sold and broken. Now they were taking back what was stolen, and they weren't asking. Word spread fast. Roman officials, panicked, sent desperate messages to Governor Suetonius, who was still far away, hundreds of miles from the firestorm that had just begun. While Suetonius was in Wales dealing with another uprising, Camulodunum was already gone, reduced to ash and silence. By the time the news reached him, the colony had been wiped out, its people slaughtered, and the fires of rebellion were raging higher than ever. Boudica didn't pause to celebrate. She knew Rome would strike back, and strike hard. There was no time to waste. With every victory, her momentum grew, and she needed to keep moving forward. Her next target was even more ambitious: Londinium. If Rome hadn't been paying attention before, it would now. Camulodunum was only the beginning. This wasn't vengeance yet, not until she scorched the empire's heart in Britannia. Londinium had been founded just 17 years earlier, but already it had become the crown jewel of Roman Britain. It was a bustling center of trade and administration. Merchants came from across the empire to trade in its markets. Imperial officials held meetings in its tiled buildings, and wealth flowed easily through its busy streets. But as Boudica's army closed in, that wealth gave way to fear. Suetonius, having rushed back from Wales with only a small force, made it to Londinium just before her. What he found was a city too large, too crowded, and far too exposed. With no proper defenses and no reinforcements close enough to help, he made a ruthless call. He abandoned the city. He took with him those who could flee: the healthy, the quick, the fortunate. The rest, the old, the sick, the stubborn, and the ones who thought a woman could never break Rome, were left behind. They wouldn't live to regret it. Boudica's army stormed Londinium without resistance. There were no walls to climb, no gates to break. The city was open, and she made it suffer. Her warriors didn't come to plunder. They came to wipe it out. The killing was methodical. Roman citizens were dragged from their homes, entire families were executed without mercy. Some were impaled, others burned alive inside temples. They showed no mercy, and they spared no symbols of Roman power. Villas burned, warehouses exploded, smoke twisted into the sky, dark and thick, visible for miles. This wasn't just a massacre, it was a message. Rome could bleed. Historians like Tacitus and Cassius Dio later claimed that tens of thousands died. Some even wrote that the destruction in Londinium was worse than what happened in Camulodunum. To the Romans, this wasn't just a revolt. It was the end of the world. And through the chaos, Boudica rode at the front, not tucked away behind commanders, but out in the open, in her chariot, her daughters beside her. She saw Rome's pride turn to rubble, and she didn't flinch. To her, this wasn't random violence, it was justice. Justice for her daughters, for her people, for the homeland that had been humiliated and crushed. And she wasn't done. Ahead stood another target, Verulamium, a Romanized town to the northwest of Londinium, rich and proud, now next in line. As it went up in flames too, panic spread through the Roman ranks. The empire, so used to control, now trembled. Word of her advance reached Rome itself. Emperor Nero, according to some sources, considered a full retreat from Britannia. Think about that. The Roman Empire, which stretched from the sands of Africa to the forests of Germania, was debating giving up a province because of one woman, a chariot, and a cause. That's how deeply she shook them. Boudica's strength wasn't just in her army, it was in everything she stood for. Rome believed itself untouchable, its rule destined, its cities eternal. But here was a Celtic queen, once publicly shamed and brutalized, now burning Roman settlements to the ground. Every town she destroyed wasn't just a strategic win, it was a direct blow to Rome's pride and its image of control. Verulamium fell just as Camulodunum and Londinium had. It was wealthy, thoroughly Romanized, and completely unprotected. Her forces swept through it, killing residents, leveling buildings, burning temples, and erasing infrastructure. Even today, layers of ash buried beneath the modern city mark the fury of that fire. But with each victory came a new weight. Her army kept growing, but so did the problems. Supplies became harder to manage, communication lagged, and some tribes, drunk on their early successes, grew careless. Meanwhile, Rome was recovering. Suetonius hadn't surrendered. He'd pulled back, but only to prepare. He was gathering reinforcements, calling in hardened troops from across the province. He picked his ground with care, choosing a narrow defile hemmed in by hills and forest. A place where numbers meant less. He wasn't going to meet Boudica in the open. He was going to fight smart. The Roman forces were small, around 10,000, but every man was battle-tested, drilled in discipline, trained to kill. On the other side, Boudica had the numbers. Some sources claim up to 200,000 followed her. But they weren't professional soldiers. They were a mix of farmers, artisans, tribal leaders, and former slaves. Brave and passionate, yes. But they lacked formation, coordination, and military experience. They thought numbers would crush Rome like a wave. They were wrong. As the armies faced each other, Boudica gave one last speech. Standing tall in her chariot with her daughters beside her, she spoke to the pain they all carried. She reminded them of the floggings, the rapes, the stolen land, the burned homes. She called on the goddess Andraste, on their ancestors, and promised that this would be the moment they either won or died. Her army roared with belief. They were ready. The Britons charged first, the air filled with the sound of thousands screaming, rushing forward in a tidal wave of fury. But Suetonius didn't move. He waited. He let them push forward, funneling into the narrow pass where they couldn't spread out. Then he struck. Roman discipline took over. Spears launched in tight formation, shields locked, gladius blades short and deadly cut into the chaos. The Britons smashed against the Roman line again and again, but it didn't break. It held, then pushed forward, step by step, unyielding. Panic spread. Behind Boudica's warriors were wagons, camp followers, and families, those who had come to witness Rome's fall. Now they were in the way. As the front lines faltered, retreat became impossible. The warriors had nowhere to go. The battlefield became a trap. By the end, it was a massacre. Tens of thousands of Britons lay dead. The rebellion that had once burned Roman cities to cinders had been crushed in a single brutal confrontation. Rome had bent, but it had not broken. And Boudica, the queen who had once made an empire tremble, had given everything in the fight. Boudica gave everything she had to the fight against Rome. Though she lost the final battle, her defiance would echo louder than any victory. The war was over, the battlefield silent except for the cries of the dying. Her people were gone, their dreams scattered like ash on the wind. And Boudica? She was simply gone. No one saw her fall. There are no clear records, no certain ending. Roman historians can't agree on what happened next. Some say she took poison, refusing to be paraded in chains through Rome. Others believe she fell ill and died soon after the battle. But one thing is certain, she vanished. No captured queen, no final humiliation, just silence. And in that silence, something powerful happened. She became more than a rebel. She became legend. Rome, bruised and shaken by the scale of the rebellion, tried to erase her, but it was too late. The people she fought for sang her name. In sacred groves and tribal songs, she lived on. To the Britons, she wasn't defeated. She was transformed. A mother turned martyr, a warrior queen turned symbol. She had faced the might of the world's greatest empire and made it bleed. Even among Romans, there was a reluctant admiration. Tacitus, the Roman historian, didn't paint her as a wild barbarian. He described a strong, wronged leader who had risen with terrifying force. Cassius Dio wrote about her fierce speeches and commanding presence. They feared her, but they respected her too, and across the centuries she refused to fade. Boudica rose again in the age of empire, her name etched into Victorian monuments, her story told in poems and taught in classrooms. She became a symbol of resistance, especially for women, who saw in her the fire of someone who would not be broken. Her chariot, its spiked wheels spinning through time, became more than a war machine. It became a rallying cry. Though her body is lost to history, her voice never left. It lives in the wind, in the flames of uprising, in the hearts of anyone who has ever stood against oppression and said, "I will not kneel." It's been centuries since she disappeared into history's mist, but her presence still lingers. Her name is carved into statues, spoken in speeches, and felt in the unyielding spirit of the land she fought to protect. In London, just across from Westminster Bridge, there's a bronze statue of her. She stands tall in her war chariot, daughters at her side, eyes locked on the horizon. Tourists pass by, traffic flows beneath her, but the ground remembers. Yet Boudica's story is not just about stone and steel, it's about what she came to mean. She became a question, a challenge thrown at every empire, every tyrant, every ruler who believes the people will stay silent forever. What happens when those voices rise? No, she wasn't perfect. Her rebellion left destruction in its wake. Her warriors killed tens of thousands. Her legacy is not pure. But history is never written by saints. It's written in struggle, and struggle is rarely clean. What makes her endure is not just the bloodshed or the battles. It's the fire she lit in the imagination. A woman who had lost everything and still stood. A queen who refused to be broken by the empire that tried to erase her. A mother who turned her grief into something sharper than any sword. And the world has never forgotten. People still argue about Boudica, what choices she made, why she fought, how much of her story is legend. But ask someone in Britain who she was, and they won't rattle off academic citations. They'll say she was the queen who made Rome bleed, the woman who brought warring tribes together, the warrior who proved that dignity can rise even from devastation. In that, she stopped being just a figure in history books. She became something more, a symbol of rebellion, of courage, of the unbreakable will to be free. Rome may have rebuilt its cities, redrawn its maps, and tried to move on, but it could never erase her. Her flame still burns in every stand against tyranny, in every voice that dares to defy, in every soul that would rather fall than kneel. Boudica is long gone, but her legend never stopped writing. To ancient civilizations, illness wasn't random. They didn't understand it as we do now, not as viruses, bacteria, or malfunctioning cells. That kind of knowledge would come much, much later. In the ancient world, disease wasn't just a medical issue. It was a sign, a signal that something deeper was wrong, a break in the harmony between body, mind, spirit, and the natural world. In Mesopotamia, people believed sickness was punishment from the gods. If you got sick, it meant you'd done something wrong, broken a taboo, offended a deity, or attracted a curse. Diagnosing the illness wasn't just about identifying symptoms. It started with questions. What did you do? Who did you anger? Healers and priests worked side by side, interpreting omens, performing rituals, and offering both herbs and prayers. In ancient China, that sense of balance was even more refined. Health was seen as the result of harmony between yin and yang and among the five elements: wood, fire, earth, metal, and water. Illness happened when those forces fell out of sync. Practitioners of traditional Chinese medicine didn't just ask where it hurt. They asked when it started, what emotions came with it, what time of day it got worse. Healing meant restoring internal balance, using tools like herbs, acupuncture, and changes in diet. In Greece, Hippocrates rejected the idea that gods caused disease, but he, too, saw health as balance. His theory of the four humors, blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile, became the foundation of Western medicine for centuries. Each humor connected to an element and a personality type. If one humor took over, it didn't just affect your body, it shifted your whole being. A person with too much black bile, for example, was thought to be melancholic. Despite their differences, ancient cultures all shared one belief. True health meant wholeness. Not just being pain-free, but being in balance. Whether it was the doshas in Ayurveda or the spirits of African healing traditions, the idea was the same. Humans weren't separate from nature. And when nature fell out of balance, so did we. So when ancient healers placed their hands on the sick, they weren't only checking for fever or wounds, they were listening for disharmony, for shifts in the unseen forces. To heal someone, they believed, you had to treat the invisible just as much as the visible. In Egypt, healing was both medicine and magic. The ancient Egyptian healers, called smon, were more than doctors. They were spiritual go-betweens, walking the line between human and divine. Their practices were astonishingly advanced for their time, including surgical techniques and wound care, but they always included rituals and invocations to the gods. To Egyptians, a broken bone or a fever wasn't just a physical issue. It had spiritual weight. The gods, the soul, even the afterlife played a role in every illness and every cure. Most of what we know today about their medical understanding comes from surviving texts like the Ebers Papyrus, dated around 1550 BCE. This ancient scroll is filled with remedies, incantations, and notes on diagnosis, blending science with the sacred, showing how medicine once lived at the crossroads of reason and belief. Hundreds of conditions, from minor aches to life-threatening diseases. In ancient Egypt, doctors weren't guessing. They had a real system, backed by hands-on knowledge and generations of practice. They could set broken bones, drain abscesses, and treat infections using copper tools sterilized in fire. They understood how to read the pulse, how to examine urine or waste for signs of internal trouble, and how to use dozens of herbs, many still part of modern medicine. But no healing ever began without first calling on the gods. Thoth, the god of wisdom, was believed to have given humans the knowledge of medicine. Sekhmet, the lion-headed goddess of war and disease, was both feared and worshipped, able to bring sickness or offer healing. Spells were more than prayers. They were part of the treatment. Chanted over the sick, these words carried weight. Incantations weren't decoration. They were power, woven into the healing process. Honey was among their most remarkable remedies. Used as an antiseptic long before the idea of germs existed, it was often applied directly to wounds, sometimes mixed with resins or fibers. Garlic and onions were prescribed for heart health. Castor oil worked as a laxative. Even moldy bread was used, pressed into wounds as a rudimentary antibiotic, centuries before penicillin. Egyptian medicine wasn't just for commoners. Pharaohs and royals trusted their doctors. Their reputation stretched beyond Egypt's borders. Neighboring kingdoms sent for them when no one else could help. There were even early specialists, some focused on stomach issues, others on eye care or on healing the spirit. And always, body and soul were treated as one. A fever could come from a mosquito bite or from a restless ghost. Healing wasn't just about medicine. It was about purifying the soul, restoring harmony, and rebalancing the cosmic order. To heal someone was to bring balance back to the universe. Long before modern medicine arrived in the West, India had already built an intricate system of healing, one that saw the human body as a mirror of the cosmos. This system, known as Ayurveda, means science of life in Sanskrit. Rooted in ancient Vedic teachings, it was never just about fixing sickness. It was a way of living, a daily practice of harmony between body, mind, spirit, and the natural world. At the core of Ayurveda is the idea of the three doshas, Vata, Pitta, and Kapha. Each dosha is made from combinations of the five elements: earth, water, fire, air, and ether. Vata rules movement. Pitta oversees transformation like digestion. Kapha governs structure and stability. Everyone is born with a unique mix of these energies. Illness happens when that balance is disturbed by diet, stress, weather, or lifestyle. The ancient Ayurvedic texts, the Charaka Samhita and Sushruta Samhita, are over 2,000 years old. They aren't just lists of remedies. They're full medical handbooks, covering everything from surgery and internal medicine to mental health and ethics. Charaka emphasized prevention. He believed the best medicine was keeping the body in balance before disease could take root. Sushruta, on the other hand, became legendary for his surgical skills. His writings describe over 300 surgical procedures and more than 120 tools, many made from wood or metal. He was performing complex operations thousands of years before the West even imagined such things. One of his most advanced techniques was early plastic surgery, rebuilding noses using skin from the cheek or forehead. This wasn't about appearance. It was to restore dignity to those who'd been disfigured as punishment. What made Ayurveda so powerful was its all-encompassing view of health. Treating the body meant also nurturing the mind and soul. Remedies included herbs, yoga, breathing exercises, pranayama, oil massages, abhyanga, and fasting as a spiritual reset. Plants like turmeric, ashwagandha, neem, and tulsi weren't just ingredients. They were medicine, protectors of life energy. An Ayurvedic healer wouldn't just ask what hurt. They'd ask how you lived, what you ate, how you slept, and what weighed on your heart. Healing was about understanding the whole person and guiding them back into balance with the world around them. A fever, not just with herbs, but by shifting your sleep cycle, calming emotional stress, and reigniting your digestive fire, called Agni. In Ayurveda, illness is never random. It's nature's signal that something is off, because you are not separate from nature, you are nature. And when the balance tips, healing is the journey back into harmony. In ancient China, health wasn't just about the body either. It was about energy. The invisible life force called qi, pronounced chi, flowed through all living things, and the secret to health was keeping that energy moving, freely and in balance. When qi was blocked or out of sync, illness followed. Traditional Chinese medicine, or TCM, grew out of this idea. It's one of the oldest continuous medical systems in the world. To understand sickness, ancient Chinese physicians looked outward, watching the seasons change, tracking moon phases, studying animals, and mapping the stars. Nature revealed patterns, and from those patterns came two guiding principles, yin and yang, and the five elements: wood, fire, earth, metal, and water. Yin was cool, dark, internal, and quiet. Yang was hot, bright, external, and active. Every part of the body, every emotion, every function was a balance of these opposites. A fever, for example, wasn't just heat, it was an overload of yang. Exhaustion might signal weakened yin. The goal was always the same: restore balance. Diagnosis wasn't based on machines or lab work. It was sensory and intuitive. Doctors read the tongue like a map. They felt the pulse in multiple positions. They listened closely to a patient's voice and tone, asked about their dreams, their emotions, even their bowel habits. Everything meant something. Every detail told a story about qi. To heal, they used a wide array of tools. Acupuncture guided the flow of energy through the body's meridians. Moxibustion, burning dried mugwort near the skin, warmed and activated that flow. Cupping drew out stagnation. Herbal formulas were carefully tailored, while breathing exercises, qigong, and food therapy reinforced balance from the inside out. The ancient text Huangdi Neijing, the Yellow Emperor's Inner Canon, compiled more than 2,000 years ago, still anchors TCM practice today. It wasn't just a list of diseases and cures. It explored causes, prevention, the impact of emotions, and how to live in harmony with the world. According to this wisdom, anger could damage the liver, grief could weaken the lungs, and fear could disturb the kidneys. Healing, then, wasn't just about fixing organs. It was about calming the heart, restoring peace to the soul, and rebalancing the world within. In ancient Chinese thought, a person couldn't be treated separately from their surroundings. To heal the body, one had to consider the wind, the dampness, the seasons, and the spirit. Because in every breath, every heartbeat, they believed qi was speaking, and the healer's job was to listen. Meanwhile, in the temples of ancient Greece and the busy forums of Rome, medicine began to take a different path. Slowly, it stepped away from the gods and toward observation, logic, and theory. But even here, health was still about balance, about maintaining the delicate flow of forces within the body. At the heart of this view was the theory of the four humors, introduced by the Greek physician Hippocrates and later refined by Roman doctors like Galen. According to this model, the body was governed by four essential fluids: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. Each humor was tied to one of the four elements: air, water, fire, and earth, and to a certain temperament or personality. A healthy person had all four humors in the right proportions. Illness, they believed, came from an imbalance, too much or too little of one. If someone was feverish and irritable, they were thought to have an excess of yellow bile connected to heat and aggression. A pale, sluggish patient might have too much phlegm associated with cold and moisture. So, treatments were all about restoring that internal harmony. Doctors used bloodletting, purging, fasting, and diet adjustments to rebalance the system. While the science of the humors would eventually give way to modern biology, the idea behind it, that health is about internal balance, remained deeply rooted in Western thought for centuries. The body wasn't separate from the world. It was part of it. Illness wasn't just something that happened to you. It was a sign that something had gone wrong in your relationships, with nature, with your community, with the spirit world, or within yourself. Healing meant restoring those bonds. The Greeks believed in more than just humors and fluids. They saw medicine as a blend of science, observation, and environmental awareness. Hippocrates, the father of Western medicine, emphasized that treatment should focus on the whole person, not just the illness. He urged his students to consider everything: the time of year, the wind, the quality of water, the patient's emotions. His teachings laid the foundation for what we now call holistic care. The famous Hippocratic Oath, which still influences modern medical ethics, called on doctors to do no harm and to treat with humility and care. Greek healing wasn't confined to the clinic either. Sanctuaries called Asclepia, named after the healing god Asclepius, were scattered across the Greek world. These were more than hospitals, they were spiritual sanctuaries. People came not just for medicine, but for renewal. They underwent purification rituals, exercised, followed special diets, and prayed. At night, they slept in sacred dormitories, hoping to receive divine guidance through dreams. When Greek knowledge passed into Rome, it expanded further. Galen, a Greek physician who lived in Rome, became one of the most influential doctors of the ancient world. He treated gladiators, studied anatomy through animal dissection, and wrote hundreds of medical texts. Galen helped unify Greek medical theory, especially humorism, into a structured system that would dominate Western medicine for centuries. Though not all of his conclusions were correct, his impact was massive. He shifted medicine toward the idea that the human body, while complex, could be understood through study, reason, and practice, not just prayer. But long before Hippocrates, Galen, or the temples of Asclepius, medicine was already thriving in communities around the world, often without writing, without scrolls, but with deep knowledge passed through memory and experience. Among indigenous peoples, medicine wasn't a job, it was a way of life. In Native American tribes, healers were more than medical experts. They were spiritual leaders, counselors, teachers, and guardians of wisdom. Illness was seen not just as a physical condition, but as a disruption in balance between a person and the land, their ancestors, their tribe, or the spirit world. Healing was reconnection. Plants were at the heart of their practice. Different tribes, like the Cherokee, Lakota, and Navajo, knew the land like an open textbook. They knew which roots eased pain, which leaves reduced fever, which bark stopped bleeding. Sacred plants like sage, cedar, sweetgrass, and tobacco weren't just used medicinally, they were spiritual tools. Smudging rituals cleansed the energy of a person or place, inviting healing, not just of the body but of the spirit. Intention mattered as much as action. Healing ceremonies were carefully prepared and deeply respected. Sweat lodges helped purge toxins and emotional burdens. Vision quests guided individuals through spiritual transformation. Drumming and chanting aligned the community's energy and called on ancestral forces. Sometimes, when trauma was severe, the soul was believed to flee the body. In those cases, healers would perform soul retrieval, rituals meant to call back the lost essence of a person, restoring their strength and identity. This deep connection to nature and spirit isn't unique to North America. In the Amazon, shamans still work with plant medicines like ayahuasca, a powerful brew that brings vivid visions. These are not recreational trips, they are sacred journeys, revealing hidden sources of suffering. The plants are seen as teachers, not just treatments. In Aboriginal Australia, traditional healing, called bush medicine, draws from herbs, minerals, and dreamtime stories. Healing there means restoring the flow between a person, the land, and the ancestral songlines that map both geography and identity. These practices aren't written in books. They live in the landscape itself, in stories, songs, and ceremonies. To indigenous healers, medicine isn't just about mending the body. It's about remembering who you are, where you come from, and how you are connected to everything around you. It's about healing in every sense of the word. Modern medicine may rely on machines, labs, and scans, but long before all that, the earth was the first pharmacy, and healing wasn't about fighting disease, it was about remembering who we are. Across ancient civilizations, no matter the language, landscape, or belief system, one truth remained. Healing took more than medicine. It needed spirit. Whether illness was blamed on a curse, a broken soul, or divine punishment, ancient people believed that true healing started in the invisible world, and the doorway to that world was ritual. In Mesopotamia, before formal medicine even existed, people turned to priests and exorcists. Sickness was believed to come from evil spirits or offended gods. Clay tablets show us the depth of their healing rituals. Chants whispered as poultices were applied, protective figurines buried under homes, offerings made to gods. The ritual wasn't a side note, it was the cure. In Egypt, no healer worked without calling on the gods. Before honey touched a wound or a bandage was wrapped around a limb, prayers were spoken to Thoth, the god of wisdom, or to Sekhmet, the fierce goddess of both healing and destruction. Illness was a sign of cosmic disorder. To heal someone meant restoring Mat, the universal principle of balance, truth, and harmony. In many African cultures, healers known as Ngangas or Sangomas carried the role of doctor, priest, and guide. They used herbs, yes, but also drumming, dance, and divination to enter trance states, speak with ancestors, and travel the spirit realm. The spiritual cause of illness had to be known before the physical could be treated. Even in classical Greece, where logic and reason were rising, ritual held firm. In the healing temples of Asclepia, patients underwent purification, fasting, and prayer. At night, they slept beneath statues of Asclepius, god of medicine, hoping to receive visions in their dreams. These dreams were seen as messages, and temple priests used them to guide treatment. To ancient people, ritual wasn't superstition, it was structure. It gave pain meaning. It made space for grief and offered a way to move through it. Ritual turned fear into hope and gave the sick a reason to believe they weren't alone. Today, science talks about the placebo effect, the measurable power of belief. The ancients didn't have clinical trials, but they understood something deeply true. Sometimes a word spoken with care, a gesture made with reverence, or a moment of connection can heal deeper than any medicine. Because not all wounds are visible, and not all healing comes from matter. When we imagine ancient surgery, we might think of crude tools and unbearable pain, but the reality is far more skillful and more human. Across the ancient world, surgeries were done with surprising precision and intention. There was no anesthesia, no sterile gloves, no modern machines, but there was courage and there was knowledge passed down through generations. In India, over 2,000 years ago, the Sushruta Samhita laid out more than 300 surgical techniques. Its author, Sushruta, is often called the father of surgery. He wrote about removing tumors, repairing hernias, setting bones, and even reconstructing noses, a procedure that would later be known as plastic surgery. These weren't guesses. They were techniques honed through real experience and careful thought. Sushruta described dozens of surgical tools: scalpels, forceps, needles, probes, many made from iron, some carved from stone. He stressed hygiene, the importance of preparing both the tools and the patient, and learning anatomy through dissection, even if it was often limited to animals. His surgical knowledge didn't stay confined to India. It spread, carried through time into Islamic medicine, and eventually influenced European practices. His work reminds us that surgery, like healing itself, was never just about cutting. It was about skill, knowledge, and the sacred responsibility of easing another person's pain. Wholeness for connection, to each other, to nature, and to something greater than ourselves. In ancient Egypt, surgery wasn't separated from spirit. Medical papyri describe how to stitch wounds, reset dislocated limbs, and drain abscesses. Tools found in tombs, bronze knives, bone saws, and cauterizing rods show how advanced their practice was. They even performed trepanation, cutting holes in the skull to relieve pressure or treat head trauma. And many of those skulls show signs of healing, proof that patients survived. Egypt wasn't alone. In pre-Columbian Peru, archaeologists have uncovered hundreds of skulls with trepanation marks, many from warriors wounded in battle. The survival rate in some areas exceeded 80% based on signs of bone regeneration. These surgeons likely used coca leaves or fermented maize beer to numb pain and applied herbal antiseptics to prevent infection. It wasn't guesswork. It was skill passed through generations. In the Greco-Roman world, Galen elevated surgery through a combination of battlefield observation and animal dissection. By treating injured gladiators, he gained first-hand knowledge of the nervous system and circulatory pathways, laying down the early groundwork for anatomy. Roman military doctors brought that knowledge to the front lines. They cauterized wounds, used clamps and ligatures, and did their best to save lives under brutal conditions. Surgery was dangerous, but it was deeply respected. Surgeons weren't just cutters. They were brave artists with blades, daring to open the body in hopes of drawing life from pain. Their knowledge wasn't complete, but it was powerful, and it survives in every operating room today. We now live in an age of digital imaging, robotic surgery, and genetic mapping. We can look inside the human body in seconds and send treatments around the world with a single click. Yet even with all our advancements, the voice of the ancient world still lingers in the background. You'll hear it in yoga classes rooted in Ayurveda. You'll see it in pharmacies stocked with Chinese herbs. You'll feel it in hospital chapels where smudging ceremonies are held for indigenous patients. And you'll recognize it every time a doctor pledges do no harm, a promise that began with Hippocrates. Modern surgical tools trace their heritage back to the iron instruments of Sushruta. Our growing focus on preventative care, mental health, and whole-person treatment has deep roots in the ancient idea that mind, body, and spirit are inseparable. Science now confirms what the ancients always knew. Emotional trauma, stress, and isolation can harm the body. Meditation, once practiced by sages, is now prescribed for its neurological benefits. Forest bathing, originating from Shinto and indigenous wisdom, is recommended for anxiety. Even the placebo effect, once dismissed, is now a serious subject of study. Belief, it turns out, has power. It's tempting to look at ancient medicine and call it outdated, just myth, folklore, or guesswork. But when we look more closely, we find something profound. A worldview that saw illness not just as a physical failure, but as a call for balance, a signal that something inside or outside the person had gone wrong. That perspective still matters. Because medicine is not only about curing, it's about meaning, about comfort, about being seen and heard and understood. The ancients knew this without needing proof. Whether they used herbs, chants, needles, or scalpels, they understood that healing was sacred. Today, as we stand on the edge of AI, biotechnology, and personalized medicine, we may think we're moving into something entirely new. But maybe, just maybe, we're coming home. With new tools, with deeper understanding, but with the same human heart. Still searching for balance, still longing to be whole. She writes, "I cannot speak, my tongue is broken, a thin flame runs under my skin." Her love was not distant or symbolic. It was immediate, raw, and alive. These were not myths. These were people she knew, cared for, longed for. Her poetry didn't hide behind allegory. It looked directly at the heart and dared to name what it felt. To heal, to remember, to feel whole, not just in body but in soul. This is what Sappho's poetry offered and still offers. She didn't build temples, didn't lead armies, didn't write manifestos. Instead, she gave the world brief, incandescent glimpses into the human heart. Her verses spoke softly, but they endured longer than marble or iron. And in doing so, she proved that emotion, honestly expressed, has its own kind of power. Her name drifts through time like a half-heard song, her words scattered like petals across centuries. We don't need her full story to feel her presence. It's in the rhythm of lovers' whispers, in the ache of missing someone, in the fierce beauty of a fleeting moment. Sappho showed that poetry could be a kind of medicine, a balm for the spirit. Her island Lesbos gave her voice roots, a place of sensual richness, of community, of sacred feminine space. The women she wrote to were not muses standing on pedestals. They were equals, sisters, friends, loves. The intensity of her emotions, her longing and joy and grief, wasn't just personal, it was universal. Even as much of her work was lost to fire, censorship, or time, what remains still sings. The fragments, sometimes no more than a line, contain entire worlds. They remind us that sometimes a single image, a single truth, can speak more than a whole epic. Sappho's strength was not in volume but in intimacy, in her refusal to stay silent, in her insistence that emotion, especially women's emotion, deserved to be heard and remembered. In a world that often silenced or ignored women, she spoke in full color, and centuries later we still listen. Her poetry remains a sanctuary, a place where love is sacred, vulnerability is strength, and beauty is a form of truth. Through her, we are reminded that healing is not always found in answers or cures. Sometimes it lives in the ability to feel deeply, to name what hurts, and to let longing sing. Sappho may be lost to history in many ways, her face unknown, her life half-guessed, but her voice endures, whispered in verses, carried on the wind, not needing monuments because her words became them. Not seeking immortality and yet finding it. Because when we speak of love that transcends shame, of passion that defies erasure, of poetry that feels like prayer, we are still, even now, whispering her name, the rising and falling of breath, a rhythm that mirrored the way love comes and goes, steady, then sudden, then silent. I have not had one word from her. I beg you, bring her back to me. These words didn't emerge from epic myth or imagined drama. They came from life. A lived, breathing world where women sang by lamplight, sharing emotion like a communal language. In that circle of voices, Sappho's poems were more than art. They were moments of truth, woven into melody, passed from heart to heart. Though later generations tried to twist her legacy, turning it into scandal, speculation, or silence, Lesbos remained the soil where her truth first bloomed. The island wasn't just where she lived, it was part of her, and she became part of it, its pulse, its breath, its unspoken language. Lesbos was no backwater. It was a haven of music, poetry, sensuality, and deep feminine presence. And Sappho didn't just exist there, she embodied it. While the world celebrated Homer's heroes and the clashing of swords, Sappho turned her gaze inward. She wrote not of gods and battles, but of shy glances, trembling hands, the sudden rush of feeling when someone you love enters the room. She was one of the first poets in Western history to write as I, not just telling a story, but living in it. Her voice wasn't an observer's, it was a participant's, honest and unafraid. She felt love, she felt jealousy, she felt joy and grief, and she wrote it all down. What made her truly radical wasn't just that she wrote about love, it's that she wrote to women, about women as a woman. At a time when female voices were expected to remain behind closed doors, she sang hers out loud. Public life, literature, and intellectual debate were considered the domain of men. But Sappho didn't ask for permission to enter that world. She created her own, one where emotional intimacy was sacred and the personal was poetic. She didn't speak in vague metaphors. She named the women she loved. She remembered their perfume, the softness of their skin, the laughter in their eyes. In one poem, she watches a beloved speak to another and writes, "He is equal to the gods, that man who sits beside you." Her jealousy simmers, tender and restrained. She doesn't scream, she aches, and in that ache, she offers something timeless, unrequited love, felt across every age, in every language. Sappho's poems are rich with sensuality, but never crude. She describes the curve of a neck, the hush of moonlight on bare skin, the quiet of shared sleep. Her words were erotic, yes, but they were tender. Beauty and desire were not separate to her, they were one and the same. Because of this, later generations didn't always understand her. Some tried to strip away her queerness. Others turned her heartbreak into myth, but none of them could silence her truth. She didn't write about love from a distance. She lived it. She loved fiercely, openly, and without shame. Her poems weren't meant to be read silently. In ancient Greece, poetry lived in sound. It was voice and breath, vibration and rhythm. Sappho composed in the lyric form, meant to be sung to the lyre, a small stringed instrument held close, as intimate as the poetry itself. Her verses weren't sprawling tales of gods, they were murmured confessions, love letters sung under fig trees, in courtyards, or in the sacred privacy of a candlelit room. She was the master of the lyric. Her dialect, Aeolic Greek, was soft, melodic, perfect for the delicate nuance of her verse. She often wrote in what is now known as the Sapphic stanza, 3 longer lines, then a short one that lands like a breath caught in the throat. It was a rhythm made for yearning, for whispered truths, for the pauses between heartbeats. Sappho didn't need scrolls of conquest or statues in her honor. Her voice, fragile, fierce, fearless, was her legacy. It was the music of the soul made real. And it still hums through time, through every poem about longing, every song about heartbreak, every moment where love is felt so deeply it demands to be sung. The divine voices of inspiration. But over time, that admiration became tangled in discomfort. Her honesty, about love, about longing, especially for other women, challenged norms that later societies didn't want to face. She was too bold, too open, too intimate for a world that would come to prize restraint and control over emotional truth. She performed her poems most likely in the company of women, students, companions, priestesses, gathered in sacred or educational spaces where feeling, song, and body were not divided but unified. These gatherings were rare spaces of freedom in a culture that often confined women to silence. Through them, Sappho didn't just share her voice. She taught others how to find theirs. She created a living tradition of lyric art. Imagine it, the soft pluck of lyre strings, her voice rising clear and strong, the hush of breath held by those listening in the flicker of lamplight. Her poems began not with declarations, but with invitations, calls to the divine or to the beloved, like whispered prayers. Come to me now, O golden-throned Aphrodite, and free me from hard care. Her verses reached outward to the gods and inward to the soul, and in their simplicity, they still feel startlingly fresh. You could set her lines to music today, and they'd carry the same ache, the same intimacy. Sappho understood something essential, that emotion is melody, that every tremble of touch, every breathless glance, every heartbreak deserves a song. Her poetry didn't just describe feelings, it made them audible, and centuries later that music still echoes. But for every poem we have, there are many more that are gone, lost to time, to fire, to deliberate silence. What remains are fragments, scattered phrases, isolated stanzas, sometimes just a single line or word. Yet even these small pieces pulse with her presence. A broken edge of verse can still carry longing like a full confession. A torn line still holds heat. Why was so much lost? Time eroded what nature couldn't protect. The fall of the Library of Alexandria likely erased entire volumes. As Christianity spread and redefined cultural values, many pagan texts were destroyed or simply neglected. Sappho, with her frank expressions of female desire, especially same-sex love, was seen as dangerous. Her voice was too unfiltered, too full of life. By the Middle Ages, her name lived on, but her voice was barely a whisper. It was through chants, through scraps quoted by grammarians and scholars analyzing syntax or style, that some of her words survived. Her verses weren't preserved for their passion, but the passion slipped through anyway, like light through cracks in a wall. Then came the papyri. At the turn of the 20th century, archaeologists working in the sands of Oxyrhynchus, Egypt, uncovered thousands of scraps of ancient manuscripts. Among them were pieces of Sappho, lost lines that hadn't been seen for over 1,000 years. In 2004, a nearly complete poem was found wrapped around a mummy in Germany. Each discovery was like finding a heartbeat in the dust, and yet most of her work remains missing. We read her through gaps, through silences, through the voices of others who quoted her for grammar and forgot the love behind the line. What we yearn for is not only what she wrote, but what she might have written, what she might have sung if she had been allowed to speak freely through time. But maybe that's fitting. Sappho wrote about impermanence, about moments that pass, about love that flickers and fades, about beauty that can't be held. Her poetry was always about what slips through the fingers. Perhaps it's no coincidence that what survives comes to us as fragments, like pieces of a melody heard from across the sea. Her voice, though nearly drowned, still burns. Sappho reminds us that lyric poetry is not about scale, it's about feeling, about capturing a moment, holding it just long enough for the heart to recognize it. Her truth was too fierce to vanish entirely. Her legacy wasn't meant to be carved in stone, it was meant to be sung, and it still is. In every poem about love, every lyric that trembles with desire or ache, her influence lingers. In every moment where someone dares to feel out loud, she lives again. Sappho didn't write for immortality, but she found it anyway. The divine, yes, but also the dangerous. As centuries passed and cultures shifted, Sappho's legacy was reshaped, distorted, even erased to suit the comfort of those who followed. Why? Because she wrote about love, and not the kind history was ready to remember. Her poetry centered on the beauty, intimacy, and desire she felt for women. She didn't hide it. She named it. She praised their loveliness, grieved their absence, admitted her jealousy, and celebrated their nearness with searing clarity. In her time, on the island of Lesbos, especially among aristocratic women, deep emotional and even romantic bonds between women weren't unusual. They were part of the culture, valued, even revered. But later societies couldn't handle that truth. As Roman ideals hardened and Christian morality reshaped the Western world, Sappho's open love for women became something to suppress. Her voice, once cherished, was now a problem. Rather than face the full force of her honesty, they rewrote her. Medieval scribes skipped her entirely. Renaissance translators softened her words, veiled her passion. Victorian writers went further. They invented myths, like the tale of her leaping from a cliff in heartbreak over a man named Phaon, a story never found in her real work. That myth served a clear purpose: to erase her queerness, to make her longing more palatable, her pain more traditional, her love more heterosexual. Some scholars tried to explain away her verses as strictly educational or merely platonic. Others labeled her indecent, unworthy of study at all. And yet, she endured. Even in silence, Sappho remained. By the 19th century, when speaking openly of same-sex love was still taboo, she had become a symbol in code. Her name quietly signified something deeper. The words sapphic and lesbian, both rooted in her identity and her home, entered the language as terms for romantic love between women. Without ever meaning to, she became a figure of resistance, a poetic ancestor for all whose love had been hushed or shamed. Even now, the debates echo. Who was she, really? A teacher? A lover? A genius? A threat? But maybe we're asking the wrong question. Maybe the real question is, why are we still afraid of her truth? Sappho didn't write to fit categories. She didn't seek permission to feel. She wrote what was real. She named beauty. She confessed longing. She bared her soul. Her scandal wasn't in what she did. It was in how deeply, how clearly, how unapologetically she spoke her desire. And history tried to muffle that, but it never could. If there was one divine presence that shadowed her life and work, it was Aphrodite, the goddess of love, beauty, and irresistible desire. To Sappho, Aphrodite wasn't some distant myth. She was near, present, a muse, a confidant, a force that could be summoned in moments of passion, desperation, and ecstasy. In one of her most famous surviving poems, Ode to Aphrodite, Sappho doesn't just praise the goddess, she pleads with her. "Come to me now," she writes, "if ever before you have heard my voice, free me from hard care, grant me what my heart longs to achieve." There's no shame in this prayer, no fear in naming desire. Her love isn't sinful, it isn't hidden, it's sacred, worthy of divine witness. Aphrodite, in the ancient world, wasn't just the goddess of soft kisses and silk sheets. She ruled over all forms of attraction, aching, unruly, overwhelming, the kind that stings as much as it soothes. To call on her was to recognize love's power to wound and to awaken. Sappho captured that contradiction perfectly. She never painted love as neat or safe. She wrote it as it was, messy, beautiful, devastating, sweet in one breath, cruel in the next. In another poem she writes, "Love shook my soul like the wind on the mountain troubling the oak trees." Love, for Sappho, wasn't a gentle breeze. It was a storm, a divine possession, a force that left you trembling, but alive. And in her trembling, in her honesty, we still find her today. In every poem that dares to feel, in every voice that refuses to whisper, in every moment someone speaks love out loud without shame. Love in Sappho's world wasn't soft or sweet. It was wild, raw, and unstoppable. It didn't wait for permission. It came crashing in, changing everything. She didn't just write about love as an emotion, she made it something sacred. Aphrodite wasn't just a distant goddess to her. She was woven into the fabric of her everyday longing. Through her poetry, Sappho brought the divine and the personal together until they were nearly the same thing. Every verse was a kind of prayer, and in those lines, the goddess of love seemed to listen, and sometimes to answer. Her poems turned love into something larger than life, a force that connected earth to sky, people to gods. That's what made her voice so powerful. Love wasn't just a theme, it was everything. It was worship. And in putting Aphrodite at the heart of her emotional world, Sappho didn't just write about desire, she reshaped what it meant to feel. But while her poetry shines, her death is wrapped in silence and legend. No one knows when she died, how old she was, or where she spent her last days. Some stories say she passed peacefully on Lesbos, surrounded by sea and song. Others, especially ones told by Roman poets, claim she threw herself from the cliffs of Lefkada, heartbroken over a man named Phaon. But there's no real evidence for that. That story feels more like an invention, an easy way for later writers to turn her love into something more socially acceptable. A woman who loved women, recast as a tragic figure mourning a man. Clean, convenient, and completely false. The truth is less dramatic, but far more meaningful. Sappho faded quietly, just as she had once appeared. But her words didn't vanish. For centuries they lived on. Philosophers studied them, playwrights quoted her. Her songs were performed throughout the Greek world. At one point, her fame stood beside Homer's. Her poems were preserved in 9 books, a full collection of lyric poetry that lit up the ancient world. Then slowly, the world changed. With the rise of the Roman Empire and later the spread of Christian morality, Sappho's open expression of love, especially toward women, became too much. Her work stopped being copied. Her books were left to decay in libraries that burned or crumbled. Some believe her poems were even deliberately destroyed by church leaders who saw them as dangerous. By the Middle Ages, Sappho's name still echoed, but her voice had nearly vanished. Most of her work was gone. Only scattered fragments remained, preserved in old commentaries or grammar books where her lines were used as examples of style, not passion. And yet she didn't disappear completely. Over 1,000 years later, her poetry began to reemerge. Scraps of papyrus pulled from the sands of Egypt, lines quoted in ancient texts, verses recovered from the dust. Piece by piece she returned, not through legend, but through survival. Her death may be lost to history, but her voice never fully went silent. She lived on in fragments, in footnotes, in scribbled phrases and whispered echoes. Her poems didn't need a heroic end. They were the monument. Even in their brokenness, they pulse with her spirit. There's a shape to her absence, a presence in the space her words once filled. Unfinished, maybe, but never erased. Though her life remains a mystery, her influence has only grown. In every century since, someone has rediscovered her. During the Renaissance, scholars marveled at her mastery of emotion. The Romantics invoked her name, Byron, Shelley, and others called on her ghost. In the 19th and 20th centuries, as ideas about identity and love began to shift, Sappho rose again, now a symbol of queerness, of female creativity, of the right to feel deeply and out loud. She became more than a poet, she became a beacon. Her name lives on in our language. Sapphic used to describe romantic love between women. Lesbian, taken from the island where she lived and loved, now an identity claimed around the world. These words are more than labels. They're echoes of her life. Proof that a voice, once nearly silenced, can keep ringing through time. Her words have never stopped moving. They ripple through time, crossing centuries, reshaping how we understand love, emotion, and what it means to express the heart honestly. Artists still turn to her, painters imagining her seated with a lyre under moonlight, musicians inspired by her voice, and poets translating her again and again, chasing the rhythm behind the fragments, the pulse beneath the page. Modern storytellers continue to bring her back. They reclaim her in novels, resurrect her in songs, reimagine her in plays. And through all of it, one truth stays steady. Sappho speaks to something we all know. The poems may be broken, her life may be hazy, but the emotions that live in her verses are sharp, real, and impossible to ignore. She captured what so many of us carry, the flutter of new love, the hollow ache of someone gone. The holiness of beauty felt so deeply it stops time. These aren't just her feelings. They're ours too. She just found the courage and the language to sing them. That might be her truest legacy. Not the footnotes in textbooks, not the statues in stone, but the way her words, written thousands of years ago, can still stop someone in their tracks, still make them breathe deeper, still make them feel less alone. Sappho's gift wasn't just poetry, it was presence. She turned emotion into art. She made longing something you could hold in your hands. She wrote love in a way that was clear, honest, and alive. And in doing so, she became more than a poet. She became a mirror. A reflection for anyone who has ever loved quietly, fiercely, or against the grain of the world. As long as language exists to carry heartbreak, healing, and hope, Sappho won't just be remembered, she'll be felt.